And there's a couple of things I want to talk about from Humanities Montana first. We want to thank them for their funding that makes these programs possible. Their mission is to serve communities through stories and conversations, and they offer experiences that nurture imagination and ideas by speaking to Montanans' diverse history, literature, and philosophy. You'll find some links upcoming in the chat. We'd love it if you would fill out the participant survey after this program, as it'll help the Lewis and Clark Library and Humanities Montana continue to provide valuable programming like this and to measure the impact programs like this have. You'll also find a link to donate to Humanities Montana if you're interested, and a link to sign up for their newsletter. Finally, you can put questions in the chat throughout the session, and we'll have time at the end for questions as well. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris Latrey. And I am going to put some of his links in the chat as well. Give me 1 second to exit full screen and we'll get some of those links in there. And Chris Latrey is a Metis storyteller. His first book, One Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large, from 2018 River Feet Press, won the 2018 Montana Book Award and the 2019 High Plains Book Award. A book of haiku and haibun poetry called Descended from a Travel-Worn Satchel was published by Foothills Publishing in September 2021. And a book of nonfiction, Becoming Little Shell, will be published by Milkweed Editions in 2022. Chris is an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians and lives near Missoula, Montana. He publishes a bi-weekly newsletter called An Irritable Métis, and you can sign up for that in the chat. Chris, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Lincoln, for inviting me to do this presentation. I trust everybody can hear me okay. Yeah, so The Day That Finally Came is the name of my presentation. It's in reference to an article that came out in the 50s about what was then the Landless Indians that was in the Montana Natural History magazine by Vern Dusenberry. That kind of talked about the early days of efforts towards federal recognition before the Little Shell tribe was even technically the Little Shell tribe. And that was a term that was kind of thrown around a lot. Waiting for the Day That Never Comes was the name of the article, because we've been trying and trying for so long to get federal recognition. So when we finally got it, I thought that The Day That Finally Came was a perfect title for the stuff that I do or have been doing now for the last couple of years since we got federal recognition. So who am I? Well, the bio kind of talked about it. There's pictures of the covers of my two books. I like to say I'm a storyteller and make it very clear that I am not a historian. I'm not an academic. I'm just somebody who is a Little Shell member, and I just decided it was important that our story be told. So sometimes I tell stories through poetry. Sometimes I tell stories through magazine articles. Sometimes I tell stories through actual fictional stories. Sometimes I tell stories walking out on stage in front of an audience and telling a story related to whatever the topic is. And for me, the most important story that I'm involved in telling is the story of the Métis people and the Little Shell people. We would not be here, I would not be here doing what I do without the efforts of people who, like Dusenberry, who have passed on, didn't live to see our successful federal recognition. Same with Nicholas Vrooman, who particularly was my mentor and wrote the book, The Whole Country Was One Robe, Little Shell Tribes America is the subtitle, something like that. He passed away 5 months before we got federal recognition, and we would not have it without his effort. So I do these Little Shell things out of a personal interest, as well as an obligation I feel to carry that torch that other people who carried it for us to begin with. And now there are a number of us who are doing the same thing. Finally, I grew up in Frenchtown, which unbeknownst to me was part of what we will talk about as the Metis Archipelago. And that is just all of the towns around this state in particular, where Métis people, the landless people, ended up settling and gathering in our effort to kind of keep our family connections and our culture alive. So that's who I am. So I like to start out like right at the end, really, it's 574. We were the 574th federally recognized tribe in the United States. And we were recognized in December of 2019 after, really serious efforts beginning in 1978. And really, it goes back to, for me, the Old Crossing Treaty of 1863 is when things really started to go sour for our people. So, at the time, that was 156 years of effort from when things first started to unravel and when we actually got our federal recognition. This was in January of 2020 in Great Falls, our federal recognition celebration. This is a conference room full of people. That's Chairman Gerald Gray to the far right there up on at the lectern. That room was full, and there were two other rooms that they had video feeds so that people who didn't fit in that space could see what was going on. And it was a very emotional and momentous event for everybody, because all the years of effort. And that was actually the last time our tribe was able to gather in a large group. Our powwows have been canceled for the last 2 years in a row because of COVID. We've not had a public quarterly meeting since then. So this is really the last time that we were together. And I think we were all very eager to kind of pick up where we thought we were going to begin after this meeting with becoming this new nation, becoming the Little Shell tribe as the entity that we always saw ourselves as, but we're kind of under the thumb of the feds to kind of not allow us to become what we were ultimately hoping to become. So federal recognition, what does that even mean? So, in order to receive all the benefits that Indigenous tribes in the United States get, you have to be federally recognized by the United States as being an actual tribe. And they make that very, very difficult. It's next to impossible to get federal recognition. And it was really even a process that didn't even begin until, like I said, 1978 is when they changed some rules to allow tribes who had been cut off for all kinds of different reasons from being federally recognized. And what that allows us is like access to IHS, Indian Health Services, for our members, other federal programs related to housing, and there are state programs too, which we've been recognized by the state of Montana since 2000. But grants for things like we have a tobacco program that we can use to educate our youth, in hopes that they don't take up tobacco use. All these different programs that are only available to federally recognized tribes. We get land, sort of. We will be able to purchase a chunk of land that will then be put into trust by the federal recognition process, kind of like a reservation. For us, we're not going to get enough land that would allow us to make it a reservation, but it's a similar concept to how other tribes like the CSKT up north of me here in Missoula in the Flathead Valley, the Flathead Reservation. That's, the reservation lands are held in trust by the federal government, which means we don't have to pay taxes on that land. It means that as generations unfold, that land doesn't change hands because it's not really owned by anybody. It's trust land belonging to the tribe as a tribal entity. We are technically now a sovereign nation. So our relationship with the federal government is a political relationship. You get a lot of talk about blood and whether you're Indian or not. And that is a diversion from what our relationship really is. It has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with a political relationship, which is a whole tangent we can go on down that someday maybe I will do a presentation around it. But the important thing to remember is that we are a nation surrounded on all sides by a nation that has only ever wanted to eradicate us. So, the whole idea that, oh, great, the feds gave us something wonderful, we're federal recognized. My view of that is that they finally admitted the mistake they made 156 years ago. They didn't give us anything. We already had it. Their federal recognition, to my way of thinking, is an apology for 150 plus years of not allowing us to be who we are. One good thing that happened, well, I mean, you hate to call it a good thing because it's a global pandemic, but if we had not been federally recognized, we would not have been in line for CARES Act COVID relief money. And we went, I mean, this is an old line I use all the time. We went from being a tribe who literally, a decade ago was financing our operations through bake sales and raffles to all of a sudden having $25 million in the bank because of our COVID relief money. And what that allowed us to do is jumpstart programs that Chairman Gray wanted to do all along that probably would have taken at least a decade to get up and running. So like in 2 weeks, our own Little Shell Health Center is the grand opening for it. We would have had to wait for IHS to build one for us if we wanted one, say in Great Falls where we're based. And that was over 100 years down the road based on their allocations and backlog and their budget and all the things that they are woefully underfunded to do for tribes. So we used our COVID relief money to buy a veterinary facility and refurbish it as a health facility for our members. We upgraded our office situation in our cultural center so that we have a commercial kitchen there, and we redid the bathrooms and all of the things that you have to do for facilities to make them healthy environments with air circulation and all those things. We purchased delivery vehicles so that we could deliver food out to our elders that are spread out all over the High Line, from Great Falls. All of these things that, as Chairman Gray told me, you buy one of these vans and it's, say $30,000, and you think, wow, that's a lot of money. And then you look in your bank account and that's just a tiny little slice off the top of the cake. So yes, all of that money was tied to COVID relief, but still, when it comes to health concerns were one of the biggest things that we were lacking in as a tribe, given those 156 years of struggle to be recognized. So you hate to say that the pandemic has a positive effect, but for us, like I said, we were able to get out in front of programs that we wanted to do for decades and now are actively functioning for our members. So that's our cultural center. Right behind it, there is Hill 57 in Great Falls. So who are the Little Shell tribe? It really begins with this guy. So, or at least doesn't begin so much as that, but that's Chief Little Shell. That is who we are named for. And he was one of the principal, he was a hereditary chief of what was originally the Famine of Chippewa Nation, and then became the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. Essence was his real name. Little Shell was actually just a title that his father and his grandfather carried the Little Shell title as well. Yabuwewi Tongue was another one of his names, he who rests on the way. So when we talk about Little Shell the man, we're talking about this guy. When he became Little Shell, the territory in red is what the Pembina Chippewa land base was. So you're talking, that's the Red River to the far east is the border with Minnesota, extending all the way into Montana and south through the Dakotas. And in the very upper right corner there, you see Pembina, which was a trading post, but was also the region for which the indigenous people who would come to be living there, which were Plains Chippewa primarily, and Cree, at least as far as the traditional indigenous people that we talk about. So that was the land base when he became, the hereditary chief Little Shell. Like, depending on who you talk to, somewhere in the 1860s to the early 1870s, he was at a treaty in 1863 representing the Pembina. So he was already at that point the Little Shell of the Little Shell people. in as early as 1863. So, the records aren't as good as maybe we would expect them to be, but he was there at Old Crossing, which we'll talk about. So that was the land that he essentially inherited, that he was trying to protect as one of the top two chiefs of the Pembina Nation at that time. So that group, the Pembina Chippewa, were really a mix not only of the Plains Chippewa or Ojibwe people, same thing, just different way to pronounce the name, but also the Métis people, which I'm going to talk about, and it extended up into Canada, up into the Red River Valley. And there's the Métis people are recognized as a distinct cultural group in Canada in a way that they are not in the United States. But the Pembina was a mixed nation of both of those peoples. And they really started in the 1850s with United States drafting treaties in an effort to take all of that land. And there was a treaty in 1854 that was never ratified, that was the first real effort to kind of block off like the Red Lake Ojibwe, and this is before the Turtle Mountain Reservation. So the early 1850s is when the United States government and the Minnesota territorial government were really making an effort to get that land for settlers. 1863 Treaty of Old Crossing, I mentioned he was one of two chiefs representing the Pembina Chippewa there who signed it. And then in 1864, they made changes to it. And that was the point where Little Shell said, I'm not going to sign these changes, and I'm not going to sign any papers with the feds again, because you always fail to live up to your bargain. So that is why I kind of make that 1863 Old Crossing Treaty the starting point for the unraveling that led to the 156 years of waiting for federal recognition. And then, just under 20 years later, after that 1863 treaty, is when the Turtle Mountain Reservation is created at 450,000 acres. And then just 2 years later, they chop it 90%. And we'll talk about how they justified doing that. Turtle Mountain Reservation now, it's small. And one thing different there is that Little Shell's everywhere. There's a Little Shell street. His face is a familiar one to people who live on that reservation in a way that he is not in Montana. That, as a leader of a large group of Indigenous people who had a lot of power in the region, had a lot of economic power and military power, he deserves to be recognized up there with Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and all of these other very recognizable Indigenous leaders from that 1830s to the 1880s, that he just never has been, and he should be, for all of the efforts that he made on behalf of his people, giving his life really to his people. So the Pembina Chippewa, after that 1863 treaty, we were a buffalo culture. And by the 1870s or 1880s, the buffalo herds are about gone. And more of people were leaving the Turtle Mountain, what we'll call the reservation, even before it was the reservation, to hunt buffalo. Used to be that the people would go out twice a year, once in the fall and again in the spring, and hunt buffalo for different reasons. In the fall, you're after the pelts, or the hides, and in the spring, you're after meat, because the pemmican trade was based largely on buffalo meat, and the pemmican trade was huge. I mean, there was literally wars fought between the fur trading companies over access to Métis pemmican. But as the buffalo start to die off, more and more Chippewa from Turtle Mountain region were out in the plains looking for resources. And when the feds decided who was Turtle Mountain Chippewa and who wasn't, they only counted the people who were still in town, so to speak, and didn't account for all of the people who were still nomadic in chasing resources. So that's why they decided, well, you don't need all this land because you don't have that many people living here, and chopped it 90%. And the people who weren't there were considered to not be part of that nation. And that is what led to our disenrollment. And I'll go into that with a little more detail also. So I've talked about the Métis a lot. Who are the Métis? I like this slide because not only does it show this kind of very typical image of what we now know is a Métis. He's got his traps, he's got his rifle, he's got his capot, which is that blanket coat of a Hudson Bay company made out of a blanket of theirs. But it's, you know, ever since I was a kid, when I'm out prowling around in the woods, that's how I imagine myself, you know, man against nature type thing, which is what the Métis people really were. Métis is a French word for mixed blood. And, you know, you'll see it capitalized as I'm using it. And if you'll see it in a lowercase m, if it's a lowercase m, you're talking about just the concept of mixed race. If it's capital M, you were talking specifically about a cultural group of people who identify as the Métis people, with a flag and our own culture and military at one time. What I talk about, you know, in Canada, there's a lot of discussion about who is really Métis and who isn't for our purposes. And a lot of people think of the capital M Métis as the mixed race people who came out of the Red River Valley in the wake of the fur trade. Now, there's good arguments that Métis people came from other regions as well. And I don't have any stake in that. All I know is that the Little Shell people, we derive from the Red River Valley Métis, for those of us who identify as Métis. We have our unique cultural outline defined by the fact that we mixed indigenous people, primarily Ojibwe and Cree and some Assiniboine, with mostly French, with some Scottish and some Welsh people from Europe who came over in the late 1600s. And that's kind of when those first people started marrying into native tribes with native women. And the way that our culture, our indigenous culture, kind of kept track of who was related to who was through the women, even though they took the husband's name and the husband's religion and all those things. It was largely the relationships through the matrilineal part of the relationship that kept connected to who was related to who and who was family and who wasn't. We have our own language, Michif, it started out as a trade language, and Métis people were often translators in situations because we spoke multiple languages. You know, Michif being a mixture of mostly French words and some Gaelic words, as well as, depending on which indigenous tribal relationship you were in the region of, it's usually going to be Ojibwe or Cree. You've got a lot of like French nouns with indigenous language verbs. And it was just a kind of, like I said, a trade language that had enough pieces of relationships that people in the area understood as to enable everybody to communicate. And this is another joke that I use pretty frequently, is that picture this time period and these trading posts and things like that, like the bar scene out of Star Wars, where you've got all these different people from all these different cultures, from overseas, from other parts of the country. You had people coming up from Central America, you know, through what is now Texas and New Mexico, following fur-bearing animals up into the north, and people from the West coming east to trap. I mean, just all of these, it wasn't these like blocks of certain kinds of people. It was just this incredible mix of culture and language, and it's just fascinating to me, just what that must have been like. Métis were also known for their Red River carts, which I have some photographs upcoming, which are considered by many historians to be the first evidence of wheel use among indigenous people in this part of the continent. Because the Ojibwe, we were primarily river and lake people, but as we moved west out on the plains, you can't really paddle a birch bark canoe across North Dakota. So some Métis guys in a trading post in the Red River Valley started experimenting with these two-wheeled carts, and they became, at one time, you would have cart strings from the hundreds to over 1,000 headed west on these big buffalo hunts, where they would basically set up a small village or town out on the plains and hunt buffalo. They'd bring their cattle with them, the whole bit. It's a totally different idea of what the Northern Plains looked like in the 1860s and 70s than most of us have the idea of. Another thing that you will see, particularly in Montana, if anybody's talking about French trappers or French Canadians, 90% of the time you're talking about Métis, because it was the European guys that came and set up the posts. They stayed in the posts because they didn't know the landscape, but it was the Métis people who had generations of guiding and traveling and exploring that went out and got the resources and brought back to the trading posts to trade. So I like to say, the European dudes were just sitting back there in their forts while we were out there doing all the real work. So it all started in 1670 with the Hudson's Bay Company, when they created a charter through England to control this huge swath of land, which turned out to be 1.5 million acres. So it's that whole kind of in the middle, it's called Rupert's Land, that was named for Prince Rupert, who was the guy who gave them the charter. So that was a third of what is now Canada, was controlled by this trading company, and they essentially ran it as a country. And they started establishing trading posts, and it was through those trading post establishments that these marriages started happening, and families resulted from that. And these weren't, we talk about assimilation, and especially now, we talk about Indigenous people needing to assimilate with the white culture. But back then it was absolutely flip-flop, because these European people who were coming here to try and make a living off our land, they had no idea what it took to live there. So they had to assimilate with us, and they had to assimilate with a lifestyle that would enable them to survive in this utterly foreign landscape to them. And the way to do that was to marry into an Indigenous family through marrying an Indigenous woman. Not only did that put someone in your household who could teach you how to do these things, but trade was also something that Indigenous people had been doing for millennia. And we had a culture around who could trade with who, and it was typically family-based. So the only way you were going to trade with someone is if you somehow had some familial relationship to them. And the first step along the way was to marry into a family. And now, as far as we're concerned, you are family. So not long after the Hudson's Bay Company gets going, the guys who started the Hudson's Bay Company had originally approached the French for a charter, and the French weren't interested. But then once the success of all of the fur-bearing animals that were making everybody rich related to Hudson's Bay, the French sent this guy, Pierre La Vérendrye, into the region to kind of scope things out. And he comes out in 1738 with 4 sons and a group of 40 to 50 French soldiers. And they're the first to get as far as basically like where Lewis and Clark stayed on the Missouri River in a Mandan village. Only this is 1738. They came right through where the Turtle Mountains are now, down south to the Missouri River, and then west from there. And that's as far as Pierre La Vérendrye got. But then a couple years later, 2 of his sons who survived the initial expedition went farther, and they're considered to be the first to see the Rocky Mountain front, at least as it is up in this part of the continent, north of like New Mexico. Now they're considered the first to see that. Chances are other explorers had been down there, but most of those explorers were illiterate. So the La Vérendryes, being guys who kept journals, they get all the credit. This is a painting by C.W. Jeffries that I love because it depicts the 2 La Vérendrye brothers with some Indigenous people. And it just looks like, if you see the mountains there in the distance, if anybody has spent any time around Great Falls up on the High Line there, or around like Wolf Point, you go out onto those hills and you look west to the front, and it looks like that today. So this is one of those, and they talk about, historians talk about like the Missouri Breaks and things like that being places that look as much as they do now, as they did like when Lewis and Clark passed through. And that's what I love about this scene is not only do you get a connection to what it looked like when they were there, but you also can kind of sense that despite it seeming like it was so long ago, it's not that long ago, at least as far as people have been in North America and spreading across it and stealing each other's land and doing all that stuff. So it kind of I don't know, gives an immediacy, at least to me, of what time period we're talking about, and that things have changed so quickly. Can't talk about the Métis without talking about the influence of the Catholic Church as well, but it wasn't so much missionaries initially. So when those first European traders came to the Red River Valley region, they didn't have missionaries with them, but they were all Catholics. So when they started marrying indigenous women and imposing their Catholic beliefs on their wives and their families, it created this sense that the Métis were already interacting with Catholic folklore and Catholic fables and all these Christian things in a way that is different from how we typically understand missionaries coming into a region and converting people. So at the time, the indigenous people, are hearing about this one God and this Jesus and all these things. And for a group of people who take their spiritual power from multiple places, this was just a way to get more spiritual power. And in a life where the environment is harsh and life is hard, you take as much spiritual power as you can in an effort to survive. And it wasn't until after those forts had existed for a couple decades that the missionaries did arrive and had with them white women that the Catholics really became a problem, because the missionaries started saying, all of these marriages that you guys have with these Indian women are blasphemous because they aren't authorized by the church. So then that created an environment where the primarily like the officers and the leaders of these trading posts either had to remarry under the auspices of the church, or they might abandon their families and remarry with church officialdom to the incoming European women. But then you had the employees and the free traders and all that stuff who were quite happy with their marriages with their indigenous women. And that is really where the Métis culture comes from. It's not so much the upper class of fur traders. It's all those people that their relationships were familial. They were loving families, and they were there because they wanted to be, because they had created this environment where that's how they wanted to live. I love this illustration from one of the guys that was with Father de Smet. This is an illustration of the building of the St. Mary's Mission in 1841. And, everybody likes to talk about de Smet as this guy who brought, religion to the savages, or however you want to put it. But Catholicism was already 100 years deep in this region because of these Métis people coming up and down through these valleys and across these river drainages. And if you want to question that, right there in the center of the picture is a Red River cart. De Smet was led to the Bitterroot Valley by a guide, and he came, who was a Métis guide, and they came in Red River carts because those Red River carts had already established the trails up and down these valleys to communicate with people who were already there. So yes, de Smet brought Catholicism to the Bitterroot Valley in an official capacity, but it had already been there for a century. Take that, de Smet. This is a shot of from the top of Mount Sentinel in Missoula, looking down where I-90 runs between it and Mount Jumbo, and that's East Missoula down in the corner. And this is, for those of us who know the area, this is Hellgate Canyon. And Hellgate Canyon is one of those, lore says that it was named by French trappers and French Canadians, but the reality is that it was the Métis who identified it as the gates of hell, because everybody had to travel through there, going east and west to trade or to go out to hunt buffalo in central Montana, and the Blackfeet were there ambushing people, and it was a dangerous place to go. So it became the gates of hell. So Métis kind of sarcasm probably is branded all over Missoula in the name Hellgate. This is what a Red River settlement looked like in the 1850s and 1860s. So what you have is you have a very modern looking buildings behind a palisade wall there, and you can see teepees kind of back in the background there, as well as, you know, the Red River carts, you know, bringing trade goods into it. So it's this overlap of traditional kind of way of life with this new emerging modern way of life that was a mix of what was already there and what was coming from the other side of the ocean. So it created this environment unlike anything ever really seen before. This is a Red River cart train, and like I said, they would have anywhere from, you know, a dozen to a few hundred to up to 2,000 in a long train. And the story about the Red River carts is they were made entirely of wood. And every historian that you read, writing from that period, the common theme is how noisy they were, because they squeaked horrifically. The reason they didn't grease them, there were a couple of reasons. One is the grease would get clogged up with the dust and dirt and rocks of, you know, from the landscape they were passing over, and either grind the wheels off or get so hardened that the wheel wouldn't turn. So they didn't use grease for that reason. And the other reason is when you're out on the plain, you may not have access to it. These carts were pretty much self-sufficient for spare parts just on the go, because there was plenty of wood to be found. And, you know, axles break, and you know, you might bring a couple extra axles, but they were also very adept at building replacement parts, you know, right on the side of the road. Here's a photo of some Métis traders with their carts from that time period, 1860s. So 1853, Isaac Stevens is hired governor of Washington Territory, which Western Montana was part of at the time. And he goes west to take up his position there, but he is also taken on the task of surveying a route across the northern for the railroad that would connect, you know, like Chicago all the way to Seattle on the West Coast. So he's going, as he's traveling west, he's meeting and treating with the various tribes to kind of understand who is where, get safe passage across the region for the railroad. But he doesn't even talk to like the Métis and the Plains Chippewa, because we're north of the Missouri. And at this point, he doesn't really care. He's more concerned with the tribes that are south of the Missouri River. The plan being that once that gets established and he gets entrenched, he can come back and do treaties and to where the rest of us are going to go. One of the treaties that he did as part of that process was the Hellgate Treat of 1855, which happened at Council Grove, which I'm literally 2 miles from right now. I go here all the time, and there's the big signboard, and that's the treaty that created the Flathead Reservation north of Missoula and moved the Salish people from the Bitterroot Valley north into the Flathead Valley. And I like to say that if you only have time to study one interaction between Indigenous people and the United States government, you could study this Hellgate Treaty of 1855, all of the ways that the federal government failed to hold up their end of the bargain, how it shaped and continues to shape interactions of people to this day between the Salish, Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and the rest of the people who live here on their stolen land. This would be a perfect place to start, because it has everything. It has everything bad that the United States has ever done to Indigenous people. That's 1855. It kind of happens to us in 1863 with the Treaty of Old Crossing. And this is a photograph of the river where the Old Crossing treaty happened. I was just there exactly a month ago. The Little Shell were invited to represent our tribe at a commemoration of this treaty signing, which was a land grab in Minnesota that the tribal leaders were translated to and led to believe that it was a treaty for right of passage, so that steamships on the Red River and traders going up and down the various roads and trails through there, connecting all of these trading posts, they were signing a treaty to say that we can still use the land, the indigenous people, as long as we don't bother these. That's what we thought we were signing. But the reality is that we're signing over millions of acres of our land. And that is what pushed Little Shell and his people kind of back to what I showed you earlier, is what was the Turtle Mountain Reservation. So this was the big land grab in that region that is reflected earlier, here in Montana. There's a commemorative, there's a statue and a plaque there on the statue talking about how this guy, Alexander Ramsey in 1863 met with these tribes. It doesn't say anything about the theft that the actual treaty entailed. And you have to think of the context too, in that, in 1862 in Minnesota was the Dakota Uprising, where Alexander Ramsey was paying a bounty on indigenous scalps because of the Dakota Uprising, who those people who had been forced out of Minnesota finally got fed up with. And there was a brief but incredibly bloody war fought over that land. So everybody was in a state of just churned up uproar in the region. That when we talk about these treaties now, 150 years removed, we don't often realize everything that was going on and what was at stake. So we move into the 1870s. By now, as I mentioned before, the buffalo herds are post Civil War were rapidly disappearing. So it was harder and harder for us, the Metis and the Famine of Chippewa. The buffalo were our entire economy in the trade of hides and pemmican and all of those things. Not only that, but post-Civil War in 1871 is when the United States decided we are no longer going to do treaties with indigenous people. We are no longer going to recognize them as fellow nations that we can make treaties with. And that was in 1871. So that wasn't an option for us either. And that, that's a photograph of a group of families out just looking for subsistence. This is a photograph from 1874, somewhere out on the plains. And you take away those Red River carts in the photograph, and it could be typical horse culture that we all kind of imagine Indians looked like on the plains. Minus, there is a horse herd if you see off to the right and the far right. But yeah, this is how we traveled. We would pack those teepees up or just regular tents on our Red River carts and go looking for buffalo. One other kind of giveaway there is you can see that those teepees are not made of buffalo hide, they're canvas, which was a trade good. We would bring in hides and pemmican and trade those for things, modern materials that were more useful, like metal pots and all kinds of things that made life easier. It's a heck of a lot easier to make a teepee shell out of canvas than it is all of the buffalo hides you would have to cure and stretch and brain tan and all of the things that we had done traditionally, but was hard. Life was hard. This is also where we begin to see what we call the Metis Archipelago. All of these little communities that were popping up on the fringes of communities, of settler communities. So, by the 1870s and 1880s, this landscape is also being overrun by white settlers. Immigrants, again, just that broad swath of cultures all moving into what was traditionally indigenous land. And we see, they're still there, at Great Falls, where the Little Shell are headquartered, along the Milk River, along the High Line. That's, in the 1860s, that was a big resettlement zone because there were still a lot of buffalo there going up into Alberta. There's a community in the Teton Canyon just above Choteau on the Rocky Mountain front that goes back to at least 1860. Butte, Helena, Deer Lodge. Deer Lodge was a major Red River Métis resettlement zone. Johnny Grant, who was one of the first big cattle ranches in Montana, was Métis. His father was a chief factor for a Hudson Bay trading post down just north of Pocatello. And when he was a young man, Johnny Grant went down to where his father was, and he would trade with people moving west on the Oregon Trail. He would trade for their worn out cattle, and then he would fatten them up, make them healthy, and move this big cattle herd north into what is the Deer Lodge Valley now. And then when gold gets discovered in Montana, he's in the position to be supplying all these gold camps with meat. And he built a huge herd. And it was right after the Civil War that he sold his concern to Conrad Coors, who took over the ranching business. And Grant and his family returned east to the Red River Valley. And Nicholas Ruman's book details, the number of people and the number of horses and carts they had, and how Grant had the guys organized in units. It was like a military procession moving back east. And now, his mansion, his Hudson Bay Factor House, which is what the main building was built as in Deer Lodge, is still there at the Grant Coors historic place ranch there in Deer Lodge. Frenchtown, where I grew up, I had no idea that all of these family names that I grew up with, Lucier, Seard, Deshaw, Lavoie, we were all connected through our Métis heritage, and none of us knew. None of us knew that we all came from the same place. The only ones who knew were our elders, and they weren't talking about it. This is a photograph I just took a month ago. This is Cree Crossing near Malta. And this is the Milk River, low water, obviously in late summer. This is where it happened. This is, indigenous tribes were using this spot on the Milk River for thousands of years because it was a good place to cross under high water conditions. And it's still there. And it's a historic site. And this is what it looked like as the sun was coming up, like I said, a month ago. And, I stood there on this bridge and imagined these carts being rolled across the water here, and the yelling and the cursing and the laughing and the lowing of oxen and all that stuff. And it was really, kind of an emotional moment for me, just to know that at some point my people used this area regularly. Lewistown is where it really starts for me and my family, in that Lewistown was founded in 1879 by a group of families from the Milk River area who had migrated to there from the Red River Valley. And they went down to Spring Creek, which runs right through Lewistown now, where there was still a lot of game. The people who wanted to live traditionally, there were still buffalo they could hunt, and created a community here. Pierre Bergy and Judith Wilkie Bergy were the husband and wife who were kind of the leaders of that group of families. And it wasn't this happy, we're going to go find this place to live. There was a lot of pressure in central Montana at this time coming out of Washington, D.C. Because in 1876 is when Custer gets his ass handed to him. And they tripled the number of U.S. troops that were in the area out of fear that Sitting Bull, who had gone north to Canada, was going to come back with this huge army and wipe all the settlers away. So Nelson Miles, who was part of that original post-Custer military buildup, is in the region. And he's the one who in 1877 captures Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce on their big run from, west, we're in Idaho now, and he made it almost all the way to Canada. So Nelson Miles is in the area, and he thinks that the Métis and their Red River carts are smuggling guns from Canada to give to the Lakota that are farther south. So Miles doesn't trust all these Métis people. And he tells these families in 1879, you need to go somewhere else because we're going to destroy these settlements on the Milk River. And that's what they ultimately did, like 2 years later. But in 1879 is when Lewistown gets founded. This is Reed's Fort, which is the first post office in central Montana was built in Lewistown. And this is Lewistown today. I took that picture. It's still there. That was commissioned in 1881. So just a couple of years after the Métis people arrived there. And it was built by this guy, Mose Latrey, who happens to be my great-great-grandfather. So Mose had like 19 kids and however many 100+ grandkids, and the way those trees fan out, so that I regularly encounter people when I tell them what my last name is, they say, oh, are you related to Mose? And I'll say, yeah, he's my great-great-grandfather. And they'll say mine too. So this, for me, Lewistown is a big deal. It's where my dad was born. It's where my grandparents met and married. And for me, that's like I was talking about it earlier to somebody today about lineage and things like that. And when I started this project thinking I was going to find out who all my family were, and once I found out about Mose, I kind of stopped caring at that. Not that I don't care about where my direct lineage people come from. I'm more concerned about our people as a whole, where we come from as a whole, and what we have endured as a people as a whole. And I don't have as much interest in knowing that, oh, this grandfather did this and that grandfather did that. And yeah, I'd love to learn that stuff. But for me, it's more about the Métis and the Little Shell as a whole, and what we've gone through. This is a picture of Lewistown circa about 1885, where you see the Red River carts. It was a great Métis for a little while until gold gets discovered nearby, and the cattle ranching gets a hold, and then the railroad comes through. And it was in less than a decade that the Métis were pushed into just like any other Moccasin Flats community, or breed town, as they called them, for half-breed communities, which, half-breed being a derogatory term for a Métis person. So things were great for a while, but typically we ended up shoved off to the side. That's the gravestone of my grandfather, great-great-grandfather, and great-great-grandmother. I like to talk about Susie too, because she was actually a Assiniboine. And she was picked up as an infant by U.S. cavalry, chasing a group of Indians running from the reservation. And it's hard for me to talk about because sometimes I start weeping, but I seem to be getting through it okay. That's two generations ago, 3 generations ago. And we're talking about U.S. cavalry chasing Indians, fleeing the reservation, and picking up this infant. What happened to her family? Did they abandon her? Were they killed? How do we reconcile that against what we see on our southern border today, where children are taken from families? And there's a brisk trade even today in brown babies going to white people. It's something that the United States has always done and continues to do. This is not ancient history. And that's one of the things I try, whenever I talk about this, is stress that what happened to us is still happening to people on the fringes today. If we look at all the homeless people in all of our towns, the vast majority of those people did not choose to be homeless. Some circumstance forced them out onto the street. So I don't see people who just need to get a job. I see my people and what was done to my people and how we ended up living the lives and then things that we had to endure before we could get back on our feet again. Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont. We can't talk about the Métis without talking about Louis Riel, who is a big and still controversial figure in Canada. He's considered a traitor by some, a visionary, great leader by others. because he was the leader of two separate rebellions in Canada in an effort to create Métis homelands. First in Manitoba in the 1860s, which he had to leave, with the law on his heels and go in exile in Montana. And he lived in Montana in the 1870s. And he lived in Helena. And Gabriel Dumont was his kind of the war leader. Louis was the visionary, big speaker. Gabriel was the guy who figured out how to kill Canadians. They ultimately, in 1885, their rebellion was called the Northwest Rebellion, has ramifications to the Little Shell tribe, which we'll talk about here shortly as we're running low on time. Their rebellion was crushed at the Battle of Batoche in 1885, and Louis Riel was hung for high treason against the Queen of England, even though he had become an American citizen. So technically, it was illegal for him to be hung by Canada, or hanged, whatever the right word is. But the United States didn't do anything about it either. They saw this as an opportunity for them to rid themselves of the Indian problem on the high plains once and for all. And they took full advantage of that. But while Louis was in Helena, that picture I just took last month, 203 North Rodney Street is where Louis lived. And he wrote letters to the editor, and he taught school at St. Peter's Mission, which is just north of there. That's where he got married. That's where he became an American citizen, and was ultimately, in 1885, 1884, the Métis in Canada sent a delegation to get him and bring him back and say, we need you to lead us against the Canadians. So Louis Riel's, Helen is trying to kind of revitalize this part of this stretch of Rodney Street as kind of a tourist attraction for Canadians that pass through. Because like I said, Louis Riel is a big deal. Here's one of those houses on along the Milk River that people were living in, that Nelson Miles decided those people needed to go. And so they either burned the houses down, or they ran the people off, and other settlers moved into the existing houses. So there's one of those stories about the bold homesteader moving west out into the plains to make a go as a farmer. A lot of times they found homesteads that were already established, because who built them and were living there were no longer allowed to be there. Meanwhile, Little Shell and the Turtle Mountain people are still trying to keep their land. The reservation has been reduced 90%. One thing to think about is this was a legal process. Little Shell himself went to Washington, D.C. to talk to Congress multiple times. There were lawyers sending letters back and forth. But in 1892, Porter Macomber comes to Turtle Mountain, and he presents this agreement to the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, called what's become known as the 10-cent treaty, where he wanted to buy millions of acres at 10 cents an acre. Little Shell wasn't having it. He didn't want any less than $1 per acre, and Macomber wouldn't do it. But Little Shell is not in the area. He's away in Montana. It says Fort Benton here. I've heard all kinds of stories as to, no, he was actually at Fort Peck, or no, he was actually in Helena. Point is he wasn't there. So what Macomber did is he got 32 other Chippewa that he convinced this deal was better for them, identified them as chiefs, got them to sign the Macomber agreement, and literally just like that, what we now know of as the Little Shell tribe became the Landless Indians of Montana is what we were for several decades. And you think about that, just the mere idea of Indigenous people being landless, when all of this land was ours for millennia, and not ours in the sense that we were in a position where we were going to say, you can't live here because it's ours. It was ours in the sense that there's much about Indigenous culture that says, we are happy to have you as neighbors if you will respect us. And yes, there was a lot of fighting between tribes, but there was also a lot of shared resources, shared territory. But literally with the stroke of 32 pens, all of a sudden, my people and the people of the 6,000 plus enrolled Little Shell members, and probably double, if not triple that, all of a sudden we don't have a home anymore. So that's why we end up living in places like, you know, Hill 57, and we'll see a picture of Hill 57 in the 50s, just the poverty, living, scavenging for food out of garbage dumps and the refuse from slaughterhouses. That's how we survived. And it totally broke our large group-based culture, because you couldn't live in large groups anymore because there was nowhere that would support large groups of people living on the fringes. And the final blow was this Pre-Deportation Act of 1896, which is when the federal government, as I mentioned with the Northwest Rebellion, where Louis Riel was executed, that's when the United States decided that any Indians, particularly mixed race Indians living on the Northern Plains, they identified as being Canadian refugees, even though all of these people had been back and forth across the border long before the border existed, the medicine line. So Congress allocated $5,000, and the 10th Cavalry, which were the Buffalo Soldiers, the Black soldiers, under John J. Pershing, who goes on to become the top leader of the Allied forces in World War I. He's leading the Buffalo Soldiers to round up, it was over 500 by the end of the summer, where they rounded them up, did a big loop, down through Butte and Helena and even Missoula and up along the Front Range and back to Great Falls, and loaded them onto rail cars and shipped them to Canada. And of course, just about everybody, got back into Montana before Pershing and his troops did, and hid out in other reservations and went back to these communities on the edges of like Great Falls and Butte and places like that. So it was a big effort to just get rid of everybody all in one last fell swoop, and it didn't work. And that's one of those things. I mean, who's ever heard of the Pre-Deportation Act of 1896? Who's ever heard of the Old Crossing Treaty of 1863 and what ramifications for that continue to reverberate in Montana with a large, there's several thousand Little Shell enrolled members in Montana that we are a large part of this state's community, and nobody knows about our history. That's why I get all bent out of shape if I can get political again when people start talking about critical race theory, which I think is a dumb name, but is absolutely necessary, because people need to know about this history. People need to know when they are talking about, yeah, my family's fifth generation Montanan. Well, to me, that means your family was probably more directly related to the bloody taking of their land from mine. And I think people need to understand that, so that all of this I'm more Montanan than you bullshit that happens all the time needs to have a big side helping of context along with it, because there's a lot of dark stuff that we are standing in the not even dry, bloody soil of today that we need to still have a reckoning with. I'm getting all wound up. This is Hill 57 in Great Falls. Like I said, this is the 50s. Poverty. This is Butte in the 1890s, and this is a photo out of Nicholas Ruman's book, and I'm going to quote what he says here. This image is a clear depiction of the winners and losers in the reconfiguration of the land during the late 19th century American West. This dude in the top hat, I mean, he's got it all, doesn't he? I mean, look at that. He's got the vest, he's got the coat, he's probably got a line of sweat running down his back into his butt crack. And then we have the indigenous people sitting there, and they've got nothing. And this is just a quick run through of kind of what happened from like 1900 on. Rocky Boy Reservation gets created in 1916, and that reservation was initially supposed to account for all of these people living on the fringes of these communities, all of the landless, but it turned out to be way too small. So the quickest answer about the Little Shell is you can say the Little Shell are the people who didn't fit on the Rocky Boy Chippewa Cree reservation when that was created, because we are all related. We all are related back to Turtle Mountain and Pembina in the Red River Valley. Fortunes rise and fall through the 30s and 40s. People in different pockets of the state are trying to get a reservation for the landless Indians. Even Nelson Miles in the late 1870s agreed with the petition that Louis Riel put together, that my grandfathers on both sides of my father's family were signatories of. He was in favor of a reservation for the Métis in central Montana. Congress would not allow it. 1978, the federal government decides, we've got a lot of Indians that maybe we need to rethink how we've treated them, and we need to make a path for federal recognition. So that happens in 78. And that is when the Little Shell tribe actually becomes the Little Shell tribe as a means to petition the government for federal recognition. And over the next, 40 years, 80,000 pages of document, all kinds of genealogical proof that shows that 95% of our current enrollment base at the time of our federal recognition has direct ties back to people who were involved with the Treaty of Old Crossing. So just overwhelming proof that we are who we are, and that we had the hoops we had to jump through to prove that to the federal government. 2018, we were one vote away, and I like to bring that up just to point out that it was Mike Lee from Utah who voted it down. And this just gives me an opportunity to remind everybody that Mike Lee from Utah is a jackass. Couldn't stand in the way. We made it happen a year later. So December 2019, the Little Shell Recognition Act, or whatever it's called, gets attached as a rider to the National Defense Spending Act, which is a bitter irony. Even though it got us our federal recognition, it came attached to the military spending bill for a military who's only ever tried to eradicate us. So there's an irony there that's how we ended up getting federally recognized. But we took it, and we're happy to have it because we have long deserved it. So where do we go from here? I could pontificate. We are literally creating a nation for ourselves, and we are doing it in the midst of a global pandemic like the world hasn't seen in 100 years. So who knows? That I'm hoping there are some Little Shell people participating in this event. We need people to vote. We need people to engage, so that we can be everything that we are capable of. I mean, that sounds like a Uncle Sam ad, I guess, but for us, we will only become what we allow ourselves to become. And we have so much opportunity to do so many things. And if my role is anything, is I don't want people in Montana to say Little Shell. I've never heard of that. That's my mission, is to make people know who we are and where we came from, because that's important. It's important to me. It's important to the generations who have put me in a position to do anything about it. And it's important to the people who are going to come after me and all of our families. The people know who we are and what we have contributed to this part of the world, all of these historic events that we have been involved with, and nobody knows about it. So that is my presentation, and I guess I should probably check the chat and see if there's any questions, right?
Yeah, it looks like there's at least one.
Okay. Let's see. You have any information about an Indian camp in West Hamilton? Is that the question? I don't. Would that be Hamilton, Montana? Whoever asked it can unmute. If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, I'm happy to answer.
Yes, in Montana.
Yeah, I think somebody's asked me about that before. I mean, obviously, that was all Salish land. So certainly there were all kinds of camps up and down that valley. As to whether or not it was specifically Métis, I know there were a lot of Métis people at Fort Owen, living around there. There's journal entries from different people who traveled through there who talk about that. So, I mean, we've been, you know, we're on what is traditional Salish land. But when I talk about where I like when in Missoula, I like to call it the traditional wandering land of my Métis people, because we've been here for a long, long time. And like all these roads, like I-90, which was the kind of follows the map of the old Mullen Road. You know, John Mullen built that road where he did because there were cart tracks, and he had Métis guides helping him because we already knew where the best place for a road was because we were in the process of making it, you know, 2 wheels at a time. Yeah, I don't know that that answers your question, but I'm sure there was one, but I don't have any information on it.
Well, the reason I asked that is because that is on my mother's birth certificate.
The name of the camp or just West Hamilton?
This says, you know, town or city. And it says, you know, West Side Indian Camp.
Oh, okay.
So,
yeah. Well, when was she born?
1933.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure, you know, when the last of the Salish came across the Higgins Bridge in 1891, I'm sure there were still people down there living in camps, you know, because settlers were already living there. So, you know, it wasn't just the Métis who lived on the scraps of communities. Anybody who had had everything taken from them just did the best they could. So I'm sure that's what it was all about.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. With regard to the statue you showed, and more generally, what action needs to be taken from people who care to address the number of historical markers across Montana that are absent of mention of the indigenous people who were there first? Yeah, that's a good question. I know, like Nicholas Vrooman, one of the last things he was working on, and I think they got it done, was to change all of the like Breed Creek and all of the landmarks that were half-breed this or breed that, which is a derogatory term for us, to change all those to Michif. And I think I recently heard that that had actually happened. So it's the same thing. I mean, if you go to the signboard outside of Fort Assiniboine, which is a historical site that you can visit up by Havre, it talks about, you know, Rocky Boy's people, you know, trying to get a reservation there, but it says nothing about the detail of the 10th Cavalry and how they were used to round up people. And you know, that's essentially our Trail of Tears, because it's, you know, every tribe has a Trail of Tears of some kind or another. And for us, it was that round up and put on train cars. And when they ran out of money, they drove us to Canada on foot. And Higgins Bridge, you know, we know about the Salish being marched over that bridge in 1891, the last ragtag group of them horrifically driven north to the Flathead Valley. But for us, 5 years later in 1896, the 10th Cavalry rounded up. It wasn't just Métis, they even had some French tourists that they rounded up and gathered at Fort Missoula. And then when they had everybody they thought they had, they marched us across Higgins Bridge also. So yes, I mean, how do we? I don't know. That's a political thing. And particularly in Montana, I don't, right now, I don't have a lot of hope. I'm really down on Montana these days. I don't know. If you figure it out, Andy, you let me know. Anyone else? This is weird sitting here in the silence of my own space. Are there any more intertribal events planned with Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, Red Lake Nation, and Red River Métis Federation with the Little Shell Band of Chippewa asking from an ally in Crookston, Minnesota? I think we are going to try and be part of the Old Crossing commemoration every year as much as we are able to. So we were a very small delegation this year, but there's been a lot of conversation between chiefs with the Red Lake, with leaders from Turtle Mountain. I don't remember any of the Red River Métis Federation. I saw that in the documentation, but I might have just missed the designation. But yeah, we're going to try and do that every year. We really want, I mean, there are people in Red Lake and Turtle Mountain who don't even know we're out here. And We're trying to fix that. We want to reestablish these ties of all of these tribes that are all related as much as possible. So yes, answer is yes. Anybody else? Well, thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the presentation and just all of your amazing information. I am going to throw the links to Chris's books and his newsletter back at the bottom of the chat for everyone. And if you have time to take that survey, please do. And thank you so much, all of you, for attending. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Chris.
Thank you.